Welcome, welcome, welcome. You are listening to and watching Humanity in the Headlines. I am your host, Atiba Buchanan. This is Mr. David Steaton, and we are happy to be here.
It's a great Saturday in Chicago.
It is. Wonderful 80-degree-ish weather. Not too hot, not too cold, but definitely it's going to get hot in here today because we got some good stuff to talk about. What are we talking about? Oh, before we even get into that, let me just remind everyone, thanks all of our Facebook Live, everyone listening on Intellectual Radio and iHeartRadio, we thank you so much, and YouTube. Please, on Facebook Live, feel free to share the show. We greatly appreciate the shares. Get the word out to as many people as possible. And we'd also appreciate everyone if they could like our Facebook page at Humanity in the Headlines, Just go to Humanity in the Headlines and Facebook and you'll find us right there. We also have a Twitter feed at Humane Headlines. Again, at Humane Headlines on Twitter. If you could follow us there, greatly appreciate it. Always some excellent content there as well. So, Dave, we got a lot to talk about, bro. And we don't have a lot of time to do it.
Reince Tribus. What is wrong with Donald Trump, man?
Man, look, there's two people I really do not like, and that's Reince and Jeff Sessions. And for me to even on any level at all feel any degree of sympathy for them, they must have really been done wrong. So we're going to talk about that later in the show. We are definitely still going to talk about presidential politics today. And we're going to have a specific focus today on the transgender ban that the Trump administration tried to roll out via tweet. Joining us for that conversation will be Mr. Ed Younker. He is the Director of Communications and Public Policy for the ACLU Illinois. So we are definitely going to talk about the rights of transgender people, the rights of us all, and the rights of the Constitution as well, and how they apply to us. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation, but David and I will definitely chop up the politics of that decision by the Trump administration as well. Coming up later in the show, you don't want to miss our second half where we discuss the legalization of marijuana. Why would be beneficial for the Black community and for the community at large in the country. Joining us for that conversation will be a staff writer for The Root, Mr. Michael Harriot. He wrote a great piece in April of this year concerning the matter. Again, he lays out 7 benefits for the Black community and the legalization of marijuana. We're going to have a very in-depth and comprehensive conversation about that. And then later in the show, we even have more information for you regarding a case out in New York, a young man, 17 years old, held in jail for a crime that he may not have committed at all for over a year with no trial because he was unable to make bail. And we're going to talk about that, the potential restructuring of the bail system in our country, why that needs to be done. We got a great attorney joining us for that information later in the show. You do not want to miss it. So again, we've got a hot show lined up for you today. We're going to go ahead and take a quick break. And when we come back, we discuss the transgender ban and the Trump administration. Thank you for listening to Humanity in the Headlines. We'll be right back. Again, that was a quick break. We thank you for sticking with us here on Humanity and the Headlines this Saturday. We have, again, a lot to talk about, so we're just going to jump right into it. Earlier in the week, Wednesday.
It was 3 days ago.
Okay.
You're talking about the tweet from Donald Trump.
Absolutely. If you can go ahead and read that.
Transgender individuals to serve in any capacity in the U.S. military, our military must be focused. I'm sorry. I got the chronology of it messed up. After consultation with my generals and military experts, please be advised that the United States government will not accept or allow transgender individuals to serve in any capacity in the U.S. military. Our military must be focused on decisive and overwhelming victory and cannot be burdened with the tremendous medical costs and disruption that transgender in the military would entail.
Okay, that's a lot to digest. When I hear the use of the word burden, it actually sounds worse now that I heard you read it than I initially heard.
I should have done it in my Donald Trump and
no, but I'm glad you didn't. So nonetheless, that really struck out at me in that statement was in any capacity. Kind of blue, because when you think about, people hear the word military, everybody just immediately goes to the thought of soldiers.
Right.
But the military is just a microcosm of society.
Right.
They have doctors, they have lawyers, they have accountants, they have IT people,
right.
They have nurses, they have everything that you have in regular society, they have.
Correct.
Right? So he's in that sentence when he says in any capacity, that means that you can't have a transgender doctor, you can't have a transgender medic, you can't have a transgender attorney in any capacity, because again, the military has tons of attorneys.
Right.
So once again, that you and I will discuss the politics of it later. Joining us for this conversation, for the benefit of our listeners, we have an expert in the field of rights. We have with us Mr. Ed Younka. He is the Director of Communications and Public Policy for the ACLU Illinois. Mr. Younka, how are you this afternoon?
I'm well, and I wish you'd read that tweet in Donald Trump's voice as well.
We will go back to our Donald.
I wish you'd read it when playing.
Yes, even better. So thank you for joining us today. And what I'd like to add, and this is the host of TIBA, and I'd like to ask you right off top, when you saw the tweet roll out, what was your initial response to it? What was your initial thought?
I had two. The first was, and you might not, the first response was, of course, and what it was. I literally, this was not something that, anybody had known was going to happen or had anticipated in any way, the way that we have with a lot of other things that have come out of the administration. And so, I suppose I would have to claim a bit of shock in the first instance. The second thought that I had was literally, wait a second, you can't make policy on Twitter. What is this? And then, I think the series of thoughts after that really track what you guys were saying. There are people who are proudly serving in our military already who are transgender. And what does this send to them? What was their lives like that morning?
By the thousands, by the way, by the thousands.
Supposed to be the commander-in-chief reject them. What did it mean in terms of any capacity for, as you say, all of the other important roles that people who are transgender play in support of our military, in providing comfort to our soldiers? I think, then it was just a wash with trying to figure out, what that must mean like and what it looked like for people. And so it was a flood of things, but and forgive me for going on a little bit long about this, but I suppose the one thing is I thought felt so dark. We have made progress in our country in the last several years, in large measure, with people understanding and acceptance and knowledge about people who are transgender, partially because there are so many people who are out and, or being doctors or being actors or actresses or important, critical, vocal role in our society. And this just felt so dark and so empty because it felt like just such a return and such a drawback with all of the same ignorance that we have been fighting for so many years. And I think that part of it felt just so empty to me.
And we're really glad to have you on. This is David again. Thank you for joining us today. Speaking in your capacity as working for the ACLU, at the end, regardless of Donald Trump, and I agree with you, I often comment on how asinine it is that we have to have a conversation about thoughts being disseminated to us via Twitter. I still can't wrap my mind around that. But let's table that for a second. At the foundation of this conversation, aren't we really having a conversation about the equal protection clause of the Constitution? And then beyond that, doesn't that additionally show how ignorant this president is in his capacity as the president?
I couldn't agree more with you. Let me actually back up one more click, and I guess I really would ask you guys as much as when I went back like a few hours later and read the tweets, I'm not sure that he understands that there actually are people who are transgender serving in our military currently.
Would not be surprised if he was ignorant of that.
That's what I think was troubling on that level. But let me go to your question really. Yes. We have, there are laws both at the state and the federal level that we do not discriminate a whole range of issues against people. And one of those issues is gender or sex. And one of the things that courts have been wrestling with, and courts have increasingly is more often determined by your brain and what your brain tells you your gender is, than by just the physical manifestations through through genitalia. Right. And so one of the things about this issue is really the question of whether or not we as a society, we as a country, we as certainly as a government, engage in discrimination against people, on the basis of gender, simply when we don't understand what their gender is. I think that really strikes to the core of this, in terms of, in this instance, denying someone an opportunity to work or to serve in the military.
And then you have to, and again, that's the foundation of the argument. But when you layer on top of it that there's someone or some group of people in the military who are transgender, who are the best at what they do, and they serve in a critical capacity. So again, for Donald Trump to just make this blanket statement, he's actually impairing our militariness by excluding a group of people without taking into account their contribution.
That's correct. And I would take it, let me take that argument, I think, one step further, and then not only are these people the best at what they do, but with an all volunteer army, there are hundreds and thousands of people who are transgender who have volunteered and gone to places like Iraq and Afghanistan and served tours of duty in an heroic and brave way, that frankly, this is not something that a large percentage of our country has been willing to do. And the idea that we would take and reject not only their expertise, bravery in terms of protecting us as a country, just is ludicrous on a I think on a fundamental level. On a more practical level, since President Obama and then Secretary of Defense Carter put in place the policy that allowed transgender soldiers to serve openly, there actually have been a number of analyses and studies of the impact of that, the particular on units, on their, so-called cohesion, whether or not it creates, as President Trump argued, a disruption. And of course, what they found is that doesn't happen, because when it turns out, that once people are out in a unit, there aren't these issues where people see one another as by race or by gender or by gender identity or by sexual orientation. It turns out they just see them as other people who are out there risking the same things they are, and trying to stay alive and get through this. And so, there just isn't this level of disruption that the president talked about. Hope at some point we also get a chance to just talk about what really is a fallacy in his argument about cost as well.
That's an excellent point that you bring up, and I hate to interject politics so soon into the conversation, but hearing you say that reminds me of a couple of things. This is Atiba again. Why is it that we're constantly steps backwards for individuals and for parties over issues that have already pretty much been settled? In other words, I'm tired of debating whether or not it's good to raise the minimum wage when we already know that every place that it's raised, it's been good for the economy. I'm tired of arguing about, again, whether or not gay people can serve in the military and whether or not it's disruptive, because we've already seen the evidence that it's not a problem. These are things that have already been settled. So it is just really frustrating for me as an American to continually, where we're having to defend things that shouldn't need defending, and trying to prove things that have already been proven. So if you could talk a bit, I'm not sure how well versed you are, but if you could maybe talk about some specifics, if you have any, about participation by transgenders in the armed services and the different capacities that they may serve. Because I think one of the biggest problems we have in this country is the way that our educational system works. We're just not aware of all the contributions that everyone makes to our society aside from straight white males. Most people don't know that Muslims served next to George Washington in the very founding of this country. And if they did know that, maybe they'd understand that you can't tell people to just go back to where they're coming from. So I just see this narrative over and over again. If you could just speak to that.
Boy, you're so right. I often refer to all of this, by the way, as just it's the power of magical thinking. It's the triumph of politics and ideology over fact. And you just continue to say that things will work. I'll give you one more example that's a little bit off the topic, but and we're hearing it again. Listen, I'm old enough. I have lived through two periods of my life. If we would just cut taxes for the wealthy, that all of our boats would rise and everything would be great. It didn't work either time, but you continue to hear the argument and hear it advance as though it is correct, and there's no other argument that one can make on that. For instance, what you have is both the Department of Defense, as well as the Rand Institute on behalf of the Department of Defense, is about units where transgender individuals serve in our military. Find is that there is not a disruption that is associated, or a problem that is associated with transgender individuals being in those units. Again, the research shows someone is a part of a unit. And in fact, one of the things that the research will demonstrate is that when an individual is able to be more open about who they are, that helps in terms of fostering vision, but understanding. And frankly, acceptance. Because if you think about it, and it's true, I didn't know anybody who was transgender. All kinds of curiosities or questions or uncertainties about what that means or what that would look like, or how someone who was transgender would behave. On the other hand, if we have somebody working alongside us, whether it's in the military or elsewhere, or serving alongside us in the military context, what we need to do is to be able to say a person who is transgender is just like you and I, that they have the same hopes and desires and aims, and that they are in that instance somebody who can be part of a unit, understand what their role is, and fulfill that role completely as they move forward. And I think that's the thing that, again, looks at this from a serious analytical point of view. When you survey soldiers who are actually in the field and ask them these questions, that's what comes back. But I suppose, and to be probably more pejorative than I mean, if you only get your news from Fox and Friends, you probably think that there is some big horrible thing happening as the result of transgender individuals serving in our military.
Well, I will say, and I will use the pejorative, and just say no one should get their news from Fox and Friends.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the guy who sent the tweet seems to be the guy who does that.
Exactly. In your capacity at the ACLU, and here's, I guess, the largest issue when we're discussing all of this. Donald Trump he didn't send any official notice to any of the military services or any of the branches, and the branches of the military have come out and said that they're going to continue operating like they had, because they have acknowledged that his tweet isn't official communication from the executive branch.
And they've acknowledged that they didn't know anything about it.
Exactly. So my question is, I would imagine that the people at the ACLU, when they saw this tweet, go and start filing suits against the White House, but the military isn't following his lead. So is this really just a big that Donald Trump, and again, I don't pretend to understand the mind of a dilettante, but is this just his way of trying to confuse and throw more chum out there and into the system to try and distract from the Russia investigation, in your opinion?
I don't know what it is that he was trying to distract from. There is some suggestion that it was an attempt to quell a rebellion among religious conservatives over some budget issues, and he just didn't understand what he was getting into. But I think you're there. First of all, there's no question that it was simply a way of distracting and to try to get people not to focus on this issue. Number two, I do think that I think one of the saddest things about this is that again, the president doesn't seem to understand, or didn't seem to understand, that you can't simply put something out there and pick on a whole group of people, because I think his thought was, well, I can do this and there's no cost to it, that nobody will care that I'm picking on transgender people because nobody will really care about them. And, I think that has proven not to be true. Your point about, for one, your point, I think, about a reaction inside a group like the ACLU is certainly true. I was talking to people in our New York office as well as people here in Chicago, and there was a strong feeling, or a strong question for a few hours, I think, or at least an hour or so, about whether or not we should go file something in court instantaneously, and figure out a way to go in and block this and challenge this. Really only when, as we sort of step back and talk to people, did we begin to realize that there was no real policy here.
Right.
He had not made, this was not something that was coming from the Defense Department. Despite what he said, he had not consulted with the military about this. That was not something that had happened. And we were really in a circumstance where just one of these proclamations that seemed to, flow from him early in the morning, and it's not clear what meaning it has. Someone said to me this week, and I can't remember who it was, and I think there's so, I think it's likely accurate, though. it could well be, the military was in the midst of some study and some analysis about the change in policies that had been ordered by the new administration, but they seemed a ways off from any kind of findings. And as someone said to me, it is probably more likely than not that they will never change this policy. Something that he got out in front on for, either for political reasons or for other reasons, and that we will never see a change in policy that really comes from this. And the problem with that argument, and it's not that I disagree with it, but the problem with the argument is, of course, that there was a harm done already. There was a soldier who, there were many soldiers who woke up in a war zone that morning, tweets, and probably wondered whether or not they were still in the military or what that meant.
Right.
And so it's already been done simply through the issuing of the tweets.
And a harm done to what the tweet claimed to want to protect, which was morale.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that was the thing that you saw when you saw two things when the military responded. I mean, I thought the first hours of it with the Pentagon, where they had to say that they had to refer all the questions back to the White House because they didn't know what this was or what it meant, is remarkable. I think then when you get into the issue of morale, you have these units who have depended upon someone for years or months, or perhaps we're just in some sort of situation the day before where someone who is transgender had played a critical role, and today you got to wonder whether or not that person is still going to be permitted to be in the military. I mean, it's literally, it is crazy.
Idiocy. This is Steve again. I got one quick question for you because time is against us. We only have a minute or two left in this segment. However, I did want to give you an opportunity to address what you had mentioned earlier as it pertains to kind of debunking the idea of the exorbitant cost associated to the military with transgenders. If you could speak to that.
It was interesting. One of the things that was cited in the president's tweets was that there was this high cost. Things about that were interesting. First of all, that had been cited most recently in a congressional proposal in a bill that would have stripped out any payment for any transition care for someone who is transgender, both for people in the military and for their families. And on the floor of the Congress, as they debated that a few weeks ago, what they realized is that cost is fairly minimal. It's like 0.01% of the military's healthcare budget over the course of the year. And was that the Washington Post did some calculations and got a hold of some information, and they figured out that the military pays on an average basis or 20 times more for erectile dysfunction drugs than it would for care for people who are transitioning because they are transgender. And so the notion somehow that this was a cost issue was really, it just doesn't pass the test, whether you call it a laugh test, smell test, or whatever you want to call it.
At the end of the day, I think the scariest thing that we have to contemplate as Americans is that we have one of two scenarios. Either Donald Trump really thinks that he is a king and that he can just tweet whatever he can just declare by edict via Twitter what changes are going to happen. He is so mercurial that he is knowingly using Twitter to cause all of this discord and all of this chaos, and neither one of those, because of the effect that it has on the American people, is sustainable.
You can figure out which one it is. I'd sure love to know. But here's what I will say, and I should have said this up front too. This does not have the power of law. It is not going forward. But I can guarantee you that if they do go forward with this policy change, we will see Donald Trump and his administration in court. And we've had a pretty good track record with that thus far. Be afraid to go back again, but it is not. We are not going to let people, as I said, who have been willing to fight and die for this country, be pushed aside. You know, in a fit of whatever, as you say it is, on Twitter, just on a single morning. So whatever this policy is, it will not go into effect without being challenged, without being tested, and without making sure that the people who are serving in this capacity are get everything that they can in terms of protecting their rights.
Attorney Ed Younker from the ACLU, we really appreciate you joining us today on Humanity in the Headlines to dissect this topic. We are definitely going to have you back. Please tell our listeners and our viewers if they want to participate with the ACLU or any programs or directives that you have in the pipeline, or if they just want to get some more information.
The very best way to do that is, as always, is you can either follow us on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram at ACLU of Illinois. You can also join our action alert list and get updates about both events and as well as information and actions that you can take at aclu-il.org. And you know, there's no cost to do any of that, and we'd love to have everybody that, because as you point out, given this administration, given things we face right here in the state of Illinois, there's an awful lot for us to do together.
We appreciate you joining us today, and we are definitely going to have you back, because I'm sure there will be no shortage of topics and or lawsuits pending against this administration. And
we thank you for the work that you do.
Guys, great to be with you.
Have a great day.
Take care.
You too.
Closing thoughts on this, Dave, on a very serious note. In this country, we have 22 veterans a day still committing suicide. I'm pretty certain, willing to bet, not one of them is committing suicide because they serve with a transgendered person.
Great point. It will be interesting to see if we do have a transgender member of the military who commits suicide, and it can be connected to this tweet. Then what happens?
Exactly. So if we're really concerned about our veterans, you know, let's stop doing these platitudes to things that don't even matter. Let's really get them the help and the support that they need, especially when they come home. So we're going to take a quick break. Thanks for everybody for hanging in there on Humanity in the Headlines. I see we got a few comments on Facebook Live. We'll address those in a moment. When we come back, we discuss the legalization of marijuana. Stick with us on Humanity in the Headlines.
We know we're going to have some comments on that one.
We are back on Humanity in the Headlines. I am Atiba Buchanan here with David Seaton, and we got an interesting conversation today, Dave. I know this was near and dear to your heart, so if you could go ahead and just bring this segment in for our listeners.
We're going to be talking today about conversation about whether or not we should legalize marijuana. Most of you out there know that we have about 5 or 6 states who have actually legalized recreational marijuana, and even more states that have legalized medical use of marijuana. However, the other component that often gets obfuscated in this conversation is the use of marijuana attached to our criminal justice system. In California last year, when I believe it was Prop 64, they legalized marijuana, and in connection with that legalization, they also released tens of thousands of people who were sitting in jail for the sale and or use and or possession of marijuana. So there's a huge benefit to our individual states from just a budgetary point of view, whether you have a moral objection to the use of marijuana, because we're not spending money in the courts prosecuting people, we're not spending money on police arresting people, we're getting rid of the black market so people aren't being hurt, you're getting tax revenue from the sale, and you're saving money from people who would otherwise be imprisoned. So today we brought on Harriet, a writer for The Root. He did an excellent piece on this particular topic. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Harriet.
Thank you guys for having me.
No problem. Please, did I just in that opening kind of 30 seconds when I kind of just detailed it of the legalization of marijuana, did I get that right?
You got it exactly right. I always say, man, there's so many aspects to marijuana legalization and the prohibition of marijuana that we don't think about. For instance, education. We never think about how much money could go to schools in black neighborhoods that are underfunded. We know that statistics show us that schools are underfunded in black neighborhoods just based on the race of the school. Marijuana legalization can help with that. Think about all the people who have felony drug convictions who can't get financial aid to go to college. Marijuana legalization would eliminate that. So yeah, you had it exactly right. The tentacles that spread into almost everything we think about.
And again, let me just say, and I hear people say this all the time when we talk about various kinds of drugs, but I can say in my own personal experience that I have friends and family members who use marijuana, and I've never heard anyone say on a Friday night, man, I sure would like to get high. Oh, wait, can't do that. It's illegal. I've never heard anybody say, and again, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush and say that this is everyone's experience, but the people that I know who use marijuana, I've never heard them say, man, I'd love to get high right now, but I can't find any. I don't know anybody who's selling it.
Right, because marijuana, the prohibition of marijuana doesn't make it unavailable.
And that's my point, is that the prohibition of marijuana has not negated its ubiquity. You can find it anywhere and everywhere. So the fact that we're spending so much money from a criminal justice point of view and the losses that we are having to society by, again, like you just said, people who can't go to school, people who can't get an education, people who are sitting in jail. We're spending so much money under the guise of trying to keep this prohibition going, and it really is counterproductive from every point of view.
And just logically, we know that it has never worked. It doesn't stop people from using marijuana. It doesn't help society in any way. There's not one instance of where it helps society. And the people who use marijuana don't cause any more harm to society than any other citizen. So I don't understand the logistics of the reasoning why you would prohibit marijuana from being used.
Mr. Harriet, this is Atiba here. And I just know the name of your piece is 7 Reasons Black Americans Should Fight Marijuana Prohibition. And one of the reasons that you list when you start right off the top in the article, you say that the marijuana prohibition has always been racist. Can you expound on that a little bit for our listeners?
The marijuana prohibition started in the 1920s when the Hearst family, the newspapers, and a lot of people don't know, they know they own the newspapers, but a lot of people don't know that they own all of the paper manufacturers in the country. And the government to stop marijuana legalization because hemp good and a cheaper way to make paper as forest and turning it into. So they made marijuana illegal by making its cousin hemp.
Hemp, exactly.
But if you said that, right, nobody would buy that. Nobody would turn that into a law. So what they did is they started this campaign, and they started by creating this agency that eventually became the DEA. And the way they convince people is by telling them that marijuana will make Mexicans and people of darker races rape women. It will make them believe that they are equal to white people, and it will make them go crazy. And this campaign worked, and thus began the vilification of marijuana, which eventually led to the prohibition.
Amazing when you look at so many dynamics in the history of our country. What you just described was really a war between the hemp industry, and they had to come up with a boogeyman to outlaw hemp, and they go to the obvious boogeyman: brown and black people.
Oh, well, I mean, it happens in every form of politics and economy, right? When you talk about the healthcare industry, the pharmaceutical companies and the insurance companies wanted to make Obamacare legal because they didn't want people getting free healthcare. So what they do? They convinced the Republicans to vilify black people, elect Donald Trump. And so that playbook has always worked throughout the U.S. history.
And when you talk about the criminal justice component of this, when you talk about how African Americans are disproportionately serving time for either marijuana sale, possession, or use, we know people use marijuana at the same rates as black people. I have some very good Caucasian acquaintances who I know for a fact smoke marijuana daily. Pulled over, they've never been ticketed, they've never been questioned, they've never been arrested. So I guess my question is, from the criminal justice component of this, what's the solution? I mean, if you have police officers out there who are going to target black people for the use, sale, and possession of marijuana, then when they enter into the criminal justice system, they are going to be disproportionately sentenced, and then sentenced at longer and higher rates. What's the solution? The only real solution, from my perspective, is either decriminalization or legalization.
I mean, and I think people would be surprised at the disparity when blacks are arrested and sentenced compared to white people. Just think about in Philadelphia in 2015, 82% of the people arrested for pot in 2015 in Philadelphia were black. In New York, 89%. In 2012, they arrested more black and brown people for marijuana than there are black and brown people in New York City, which is an amazing statistic to me.
Wow. And again, it just speaks to this perpetual cycle, because you have one side of the government who's heavily invested in police and the DEA and the ATF. They are heavily invested on the law and order side of the argument, so they continue to take money out of the federal budget so that they can continue to prosecute these people. But then you have people on the other side. I mean, again, I would imagine that if I was an African American that was living in any one of the states that have legalized the recreational use of marijuana, and I was sitting in jail for either the possession, use, or sale of marijuana, that I would be going crazy. That just to see the 180 that you had a generation of people's lives that are being destroyed, and then they can't even re-enter the system after having served their time, and then to see and I'll just say it, to see white people in those very same states that are opening up legal marijuana shops and becoming millionaires. That's got to just, I can't even imagine how I would even deal with that if I was one of those people that was sitting in jail having been convicted of marijuana possession.
That it's systematic, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but when you think about marijuana prohibition, right, we know that it has never been about safety, right? Because last year, the year before that, and the 20 years before that, not one single person died from those. 33,000 people last year died from opioid overdoses, whether it's Oxycontin or things like that, and they don't make it illegal. So they're not trying to keep the public safe. 13,000 people died from heroin last year. 2,000 people died from alcohol poisoning.
Right.
They're drunk drivers who kill someone in every state, every night. And they don't make it illegal. So we know it's not about keeping the public safe. We know it's not about protecting lives or protecting your children. It has to be about something else. And when you look at that and the disparity of how Black and brown people are arrested, convicted, and put in jail and sentenced for marijuana, you can only come up with one conclusion, right? Tool or tactic to reduce a certain group of people from the population.
Absolutely, and because the time again is always against us. We only have a moment or two left. Before we let you go, what I'd like for you to do is kind of expound upon some of the financial benefits. Now that we've had an opportunity to look at Oregon, to look at Colorado as kind of experiments out there, let's talk about some of the financial benefits that they've seen from a tax revenue standpoint.
In Colorado, for instance, like money that they raise for marijuana, they tax it heavily. I think there's a 25% tax on marijuana in Colorado, which is high, right? But paying $1 or two for when you want to smoke marijuana, it's reasonable, right? And you imagine if you could use that money to put into scholarships. The schools that are disproportionately funded, to put into community centers, to put into education in Black and brown neighborhoods, right? It is almost in the legal way, right? So this money these millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars that these states have access to, that they didn't have access to years before if they made marijuana legal, and they could use them in whatever way they wanted to. And not only that money that they didn't have access to, but all of the money that they would save patrolling and jailing people for a drug that does no harm to society. So all of that money could benefit so many people, not just Black and brown people, if you want to be, egalitarian with it, community. So to miss the opportunity to better your community economically for something that doesn't harm your community, again, I can't understand the logic behind it.
Mr. Mike, Harriet, we really, really appreciate you joining us today and discussing this really, really complex topic. For our listeners and for our watchers, tell them how they can find you online and how they can follow you at The Root.
I'm on The Root every day, so you can just about Michael Harriet on The Root. I'm on Twitter, everywhere else at MichaelHarriot.
For joining us. We're definitely going to bring you back on this topic because we're going to continue to discuss it. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Have a great day, sir. Thank you. So, like I said, we promised you the hot stuff today. I think we are certainly delivering it, Dave. Excellent segment there, sir. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to discuss Pedro Hernandez, the 17-year-old honor student that was in jail for over a year without a trial in Rikers for a crime he may not have committed. Hang with us on Humanity in the Headlines. We'll be right back. We are back on Humanity in the Headlines. Again, if you're joining us just now, I am your host, Atiba Buchanan, along with my co-host, Mr. David Seaton. And joining us today for a very poignant and necessary conversation, we have attorney Stanley Stallworth. How are you this afternoon, sir?
Today.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate you making time in your busy schedule. So what we wanted to talk
Absolutely.
about.
I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had a couple things we wanted to talk about. The first thing was this young man, Pedro Hernandez, in New York. He's 17 years old. He had spent a year in bars and Rikers for a crime he may not have committed. He already has witnesses saying he did not commit the crime. He was unable to make bail. And he recently did get out. There was an organization, the RFK organization, Robert F. Kennedy organization, was able to raise his bail at 100, and they had to have it lowered, by the way, to $100,000 for them to raise that for this young man to get out. He's an honor student as well, by the way. So we just wanted to kind of get your thoughts. We looked at the similarities between his case and Mr. Khalif Browder, the other young man in New York that was in jail for a couple of years without a trial, and he was beaten so and mistreated so while in jail, so much so that when he came out, he had committed suicide, and we lost that young man. So I just want to, get your perspective as an attorney as to how these situations can be avoided and what reformation needs to be done so that it doesn't happen to.
Well, sir, the unfortunate part about that is in the case of Mr. Hernandez in Rikers Island, his case has now hit the national press and people will know about it. But I would posit that this is happening every day here in Cook County, Illinois, and throughout major metropolitan cities throughout the country. This is something that I'm hopeful that this case will bring some more attention to encourage our legislators, our city leaders, our aldermen, our council people for bail bond reform. When young people go into the system, or when anyone goes into the system, crimes and cannot post a bail, that means that they just lose time in jail. In this case, this gentleman, I think, was 17 years old. You really can't get back a year when you're 17. You can't get it back at any time, but certainly when you're college or do well in your first venture after high school, get that time back. So we really do need to look seriously at bail reform in this country.
This is David Seaton again, attorney. Thank you for joining us today. I'm looking at this case, and I read cases like this all the time. And in my mind, this is more fundamental than just talking about bail reform. To me, this is a Sixth Amendment violation in terms of having a right to a speedy and public trial. I mean, and usually when we have a legal conversation, we always have it in the context or through the prism of the reasonableness test. It's not reasonable for a 17-year-old to sit in jail for a 17-year-old to sit in jail for a year without going to trial, and it's a Sixth Amendment violation, isn't it?
I agree with you. I think that we need to look at it from that perspective as well. But again, this happens every day. The case that was brought against me, which is why I'm on this call today about these issues, straightforward case. We gave DNA on December 5th of 2013. It was an uncomplicated case, no harm to the individual, anything. But it took us nearly 25 months to get to trial, and there were delay attempts after delay attempts after delay attempts. Well, I shouldn't say delay attempts, but delays in this case to just continue it. I think the hope is when they have people involved in these very long situations before getting to trial, the hope is that they will bend, that they will break, and that they will accept the plea. Won't have to be tried, and then you got one more quote criminal off the street, fair and due process. And so you refer back to the Constitution.
Right. So I guess my question is, what? Obviously, this has the sticking point of it being a Sixth Amendment violation hasn't really been brought up a lot in court. I haven't seen a lot of cases about it. What is for our listeners and for our viewers who are watching this and listening to this segment, who might find themselves embroiled in the legal system in a criminal trial or criminal prosecution, reasonable amount of time if the prosecution is drawing the case out, like you said, in an effort to try and break the individual and get them to take a plea. What's a reasonable amount of time where someone might want to invoke their Sixth Amendment right to get either released from jail or get the trial going?
That's a loaded question. Of course, it would require a case-by-case analysis, depending on the crime, those kinds of things. But on the other hand, there could be some attention given to classifying crimes and classifying to account the individual's background. Time frames could be given. But the problem, for instance, here in Cook County and in many other locations that I looked at, your right to a criminal trial, to a trial within a certain amount of days, here, which can be in about one additional month. But the problem comes in the state police, they have control of the evidence, DNA. And so in my case, for instance, had we invoked the right to a speedy trial, let's just say during the 3rd month, which would have meant we had to have been the trial by the 10th month, the DNA wasn't analyzed until the 18th month, where I knew the DNA would be exonerative of both me and my co-defendant. I could not invoke that right because I would have had to go without DNA, and that would have been the point that the prosecutor could have brought up. Well, the DNA had the defendant allowed us time to analyze it, that they were liable, that they were guilty. We wanted to go to trial without the DNA, but we had no authority whatsoever, no impact upon the state police that they took to analyze DNA. That wasn't complicated. It was given voluntarily. It wasn't mixed with any other DNA. It wasn't, faulty. It was taken straight from. So that's the major problem with the way most of the statutes are drawn. And so, in the cases where DNA is not an issue, it's just slow investigation. The county investigators, the city police, slow. And in my case, for instance, we can't find any evidence of them doing any investigation. Back for a status call, the prosecutors had a reason to extend the trial. And so this really does require some attention from our legislators, more comprehensive criminal rights.
Right. Right.
Attorney Stallworth, we thank you so much for coming on today and giving our listeners and our viewers that enlightened perspective. I know that you've got an exhibit going on. If you could tell our viewers a bit about that.
The exhibit is called American Justice, and the undertitle is Black Man Blues. Throughout the 25 months that I was embroiled with the Cook County criminal justice system and with a prosecutor who had no in getting to justice and fairness, only wanted to find us guilty. Our exhibit has about 50 pieces that are dedicated to social injustice. 35 or so talented artists from throughout the United States joined me in creating poignant pieces, not just my story, but the story of many persons in our country who were involved in the criminal justice system. They arose from it unfairly, whether they were found guilty or not guilty. So the exhibit runs through August 25th. It's at 2635 South Chicago. There's hours posted on the website at www.racializedjustice.com. All one word, racializedjustice.com. And thank you for asking.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate that, and we appreciate all that you do as well. We definitely will make our way down to your exhibit before it ends, and I look forward to coming down and meeting you as well.
And I might add that the net profits, a portion of the net profits from the sales of the artwork will be dedicated to my efforts of creating some re-entry programs, and been involved in the system and have no chance for a normal existence after their arrest.
Excellent, sir. Excellent work.
That's a great program.
I might have to nominate you for CNN Hero or something.
That sounds like a great
I
program.
don't know about that. I just want to do the work. I want to help these young people because I know scores of them right here in my community. Court for 2 small bags of weed, whereas kids on the north side, kids in the North Shore area, are caught with meth and they get their parents called.
Get a slap on the wrist and a fine.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Attorney Stallworth, and we hope that you remain a friend of the show.
Thank you, sir. I look forward to speaking with you again.
Absolutely. Have a great and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Yeah. Well, that's it for Humanity in the Headlines this week.
It was a jam-packed. That hour flew by.
I told you. We bought the business today. So we thank every one of our Facebook Live viewers. We thank every one of our listeners on Intellectual Radio and YouTube. We ask that, again, you share the video if you think that there was content that people here could appreciate. And we ask that all of you continue to be safe and continue to support Humanity in the Headlines. Thanks to Mr. Breon Jones for putting together a great show, and Mr. Earl Winfrey for this wonderful, blessed platform. You guys have a great weekend.